Colonel Robert "Bob"
Sir,
Sullivan jerked awake
this
at
ticket is for
precisely
a different
4:30
flight.
a.m.
You need to
His
disembark
weathered hand
immediately.
instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there. The bedroom was dark and quiet, no gunfire, no explosions, just the gentle hum of the heater in his modest Kansas home. 50 years, he mumbled, running a hand over his face. And the body still remembers. Sullivan swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as his left knee protested. Shrapnel from Quezon, 1968. The doctors had removed most of it, but time had its own way of reminding him. He stood slowly, allowing his body to adjust to the vertical world, then limped to the bathroom without turning on the lights. He didn't need them. Decades of military precision had mapped every corner of his small house in his mind. The morning ritual never changed. Splash cold water on face, brush teeth, shave with the same straight razor his father had used in Wawiputu, dress in pressed khakis and a crisp white shirt. The clothes hung loose on his frame now. At 84, his once powerful shoulders had begun to surrender to gravity. In the kitchen, Sullivan prepared coffee the old way grounds in a metal percolator, no fancy machines. Black strong enough to wake the dead. He unfolded the newspaper and spread it across the kitchen table, a habit from before screens dominated every moment of life. The morning light crept through the window as Sullivan reached for the worn Omega watch on his wrist, a gift from his unit after their second tour. The inscription on the back read simply, "To Steady Sullivan, you brought us home." That had been his nickname. Steady Sullivan. The man who never panicked under fire. The man who made plans while bullets flew. The man who promised everyone would come home and meant it. Sullivan opened the drawer of his bedside table and extracted a small wooden box with the words, "Duty Honor Country" carved into the lid. Inside lay his silver star, nestled beside a faded photograph of Delta Company 47. Young faces stared back at him, some smiling, some serious, all alive in that moment. Now most were either dead or lost to time. "I'm the last one," Sullivan whispered to the empty room. He picked up the envelope that had arrived 3 weeks ago. Pentagon letterhead formal invitation. The 50th anniversary commemoration of Operation Spring 1975. He'd been asked to deliver a keynote address on leadership in crisis. The Defense Department had arranged everything, including a first-class ticket, a small gesture of appreciation for 32 years of service and a lifetime of pain. Sullivan had called his grandson Marcus when the invitation arrived. The boy, though hardly a boy at 28, was a lieutenant in the Marines carrying on what had become a family tradition. "That's amazing, Grandpa," Marcus had said. "First class will be good for your back." Sullivan smiled at the memory. Marcus understood. The back pain was constant, a result of carrying 7 men to safety under enemy fire. The military doctors had done what they could, but some of the shrapnel was lodged too close to his spine to remove safely. First class meant a seat that could actually accommodate his discomfort. The phone rang, pulling Sullivan from his thoughts. Marcus's voice came through energetic despite the early hour. "All packed for tomorrow, Grandpa." "Been ready for 3 days," Sullivan replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'll pick you up at 0600 hours. Don't want to risk missing that flight." "I've never been late in my life, son." I know. Just excited for you." "Hey, you wearing your silver star to the ceremony?" Sullivan glanced at the medal in its box. "No, never have, never will. That's not what it's about." After hanging up, Sullivan returned to his coffee, now gone cold. Through the window, he watched the sunrise painting the Kansas sky in shades of amber and gold. The same sun that had risen over rice paddies and jungles over young men, fighting and dying in a war that time was already forgetting. Tomorrow he would board a plane to Washington. Tonight, memories were his only company. Across the country, Eleanor Miller's day was unraveling before it began. "What do you mean he's been wounded?" Her voice trembled as she clutched the phone standing in her kitchen in Denver. Her son, Private First Class Kevin Miller, had been deployed to Afghanistan 3 months ago. "The medical team is with him now, Mrs. Miller. That's all the information I have. The chaplain will call with updates." Eleanor ended the call and stared blankly at the wall. She had 20 minutes before she needed to leave for Denver International Airport, where her shift as lead flight attendant for American Eagle Airlines would begin. Her first instinct was to call in sick, but the reality of being a single mother with bills to pay settled heavily on her shoulders. She dialed her supervisor. "Rebecca, my son's been wounded in Afghanistan. I need to—" "Eleanor, I'm sorry to hear that." Rebecca Johnson's voice was professionally sympathetic but firm. But we're already critically understaffed today. If you don't show, I'll have to mark it as job abandonment. He's my son, Rebecca. And this is your job. I need you there. The words hung between them, cold and final. I'll be there, Eleanor finally said, ending the call. She wiped away tears, applied makeup with trembling hands, and put on her uniform. The American Eagle wings pinned to her chest felt impossibly heavy. 30 minutes later, she was reviewing the passenger manifest for Flight 257 to Washington, D.C., trying to focus through her worry. A notification popped up on her tablet, several last-minute VIP upgrades requiring seat reassignments. Eleanor, Rebecca approached tablet in hand. 2 platinum members just checked in. They need first-class seats. Eleanor scanned the list. First is full. Make it work. These are million-mile flyers. Move whoever has the lowest status. Eleanor scrolled through the passenger list, eyes landing on a name, Sullivan Robert J. 84. Military discount fare, first-class seat 5A. There's an elderly man in 5A, military discount. Rebecca barely glanced at the screen. Perfect. Move him to economy. The platinum members are waiting. At Denver International Airport, Marcus Sullivan helped his grandfather through security. The colonel walked with a slight limp but refused assistance beyond his grandson's steady arm. These new rules, Sullivan muttered as he removed his shoes at the security checkpoint. In my day, people respected a uniform. Marcus smiled. Times change, Grandpa. People shouldn't. Sullivan wore his age with dignity. His white hair was trimmed in a military cut that hadn't changed in 60 years. His posture remained ramrod straight despite the pain it caused him. His veteran's cap bore a single pin, a small, unobtrusive silver star emblem that most people wouldn't even notice. You're going to be comfortable in first class, Marcus said as they approached the gate. Good for your back. Sullivan nodded. First time in first class since 1975 when they flew us home from Saigon. They boarded early. Sullivan's age and military status granting them priority. Marcus helped stow his grandfather's small carry-on in the overhead compartment of the first-class cabin. You've got my number. Call when you land, Marcus said, giving his grandfather a gentle pat on the shoulder, their version of an embrace. Sullivan settled into seat 5A, a spacious leather chair that immediately eased the pressure on his lower back. He sighed with relief. The boarding process continued around him as he took out an old leather wallet. From it, he removed a worn photograph of a young soldier with a child on his shoulders. The plane was nearly full when Eleanor Miller appeared at his side, accompanied by a young man in an American Eagle uniform. Sir, Eleanor said, her voice professionally modulated despite her inner turmoil. I'm Eleanor Miller, the lead flight attendant. This is David Reynolds, also with the airline. Sullivan looked up politely, tucking the photograph back into his wallet. Good morning. Eleanor hesitated just for a moment. Due to priority seating adjustments, your ticket has been reassigned. I'm going to need you to move to seat 47B in economy. Sullivan's blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, studied her face. I believe my ticket is for seat 5A. That's what was issued. I understand, sir, but we have priority passengers who need these seats. Priority passengers? Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly, but his voice remained calm. David shifted uncomfortably beside Eleanor. The young man, no more than 24, looked as if he wanted to be anywhere else. Passengers with a frequent flyer history in first class, Eleanor explained. It's part of our loyalty policy. Sullivan was silent for 3 long seconds. His eyes moved past Eleanor to the first-class cabin, now filling with executives typing on laptops and scrolling through phones. I understand, he said finally. An honest tax-paying citizen who served his country is worth less than someone who regularly buys expensive tickets. Eleanor swallowed hard. David lowered his eyes. That's not what this is, sir, Eleanor said. It's just a policy matter. Sullivan nodded once, a gesture that spoke volumes. He reached for his carry-on, but David stepped forward. Let me help you with that, sir. As the young man reached up, his sleeve rode up, revealing a faded USMC tattoo on his wrist. Sullivan noticed immediately. Marines, he asked quietly. My father, sir, David replied. I just wear his tags to honor him. Sullivan nodded in understanding as David helped him out of the comfortable seat. The old soldier moved slowly toward the back of the plane, each step careful and measured. At 84, he had faced enemy bullets, lost brothers in arms, and witnessed horrors most could never imagine. But never had he felt so disrespected as in that moment. Seat 47B was wedged between two cramped chairs in the last row of economy. Sullivan lowered himself carefully, his tall frame folding awkwardly into the confined space. His knees pressed against the seat in front of him, and his shoulders had no choice but to intrude on his neighbor's space. A teenager with headphones occupied the window seat, and a large woman spilled into the aisle seat. Neither acknowledged Sullivan's arrival. His back, marked by decades of military service and old surgeries, immediately protested against the narrow seat. He shifted several times, but there was no position that offered real comfort. He closed his eyes and took a slow, steady breath. Eleanor walked down the aisle, checking that passengers had fastened their seatbelts. When she reached row 47, she avoided looking directly at Sullivan. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her voice artificially bright. Sullivan looked up at her. "All good, ma'am." "Great." She moved on quickly, guilt gnawing at her. Sullivan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small metal object, the silver star. He didn't wear it out of pride, but he always kept it close. It was a reminder that once his country had seen his worth. Today, Sullivan felt like a stranger in the very nation he had spent his life defending. 4 rows ahead, still in economy class, Marcus Sullivan finished stowing his backpack in the overhead compartment. At 28, he carried the same determined expression that had once shone in his grandfather's eyes. He had joined the Marines straight out of college, learning from his grandfather what military service truly meant. When he saw his grandfather walking past toward the back of the plane, Marcus frowned. The colonel was supposed to be in first class. That's what the ticket said, the same one he'd proudly shown Marcus the night before, excited about finally having a more comfortable seat to ease his back pain. Marcus stood and quietly followed him. He found his grandfather settling into the tight middle seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Grandpa, what happened?" Sullivan looked up. He smiled warmly, but there was sadness behind it. "Change of plans, kid." "What kind of change of plans?" "They reassigned my seat, said it was necessary due to operational issues." Marcus glanced around. He noticed the uncomfortable expressions on nearby passengers, people who had clearly witnessed the seat switch. He spotted Eleanor a few rows ahead, looking down at a clipboard, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "This is unacceptable." "Marcus, no, Grandpa, this is unacceptable." The young lieutenant pulled out his phone. His hands trembled slightly, fueled by restrained indignation. "Who are you calling?" Sullivan asked. "Someone who can fix this." Marcus scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. General James Martinez, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army, the son of Sergeant James Martinez Sr., one of the 7 men his grandfather had carried to safety at Quezon. The phone rang once, twice. "General Martinez office. This is Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan, United States Marine Corps. I need to speak with the general. It's urgent." "The general is in a meeting, Lieutenant. May I take a message?" Marcus looked over at his grandfather, who was watching with growing curiosity. "Tell him it's about Colonel Robert Sullivan. Tell him he'll want to take this call." "One moment, Lieutenant." Less than 30 seconds later, a deep voice came on the line. "This is General Martinez. Did you say Colonel Robert Sullivan?" "Yes, sir, my grandfather." General James Martinez's voice trembled with emotion on the other end of the line. At 73, he had never forgotten the day a young captain named Robert Sullivan had carried his father, as Sergeant James Martinez Sr., through enemy fire after a brutal ambush in the Quezon Valley. "Your grandfather is a hero, Lieutenant. What can I do for him?" Marcus quickly explained the situation: the public humiliation, the disrespect, the forced seat reassignment to accommodate priority passengers. On the other end, silence hung heavy as lead. "What airport are you at?" Martinez finally asked. "Denver, American Eagle Airlines Flight 257 to Washington." "Don't go anywhere." The call ended. Martinez didn't waste a second. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the direct number for William Parker's private office. As CEO and founder of American Eagle Airlines, Parker was known for 2 things: his billion-dollar fortune and his unwavering patriotism. A Gulf War veteran, he had turned a small regional airline into one of the largest aviation companies in the country. "William Parker speaking." "Bill, this is James Martinez, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army." "General Martinez, what a surprise. How can I help you?" "We have a situation on one of your flights. A decorated veteran is being disrespected by your staff right now." "Disrespected? What do you mean?" Martinez explained everything. Each word hit Parker like a physical blow. My God, this is happening right now. Exactly. Flight 257 out of Denver. Parker didn't hesitate. James will fix this immediately. As soon as he hung up, Martinez made a second call. General Ford, I need a favor, an urgent one. General Graham Ford, commander of the Andrews Air Force Base, picked up on the first ring. What do you need, James? I've got one of ours, a Silver Star recipient, being humiliated at Denver International. I need your help to make it right. How many men do you need? You decide. But I want everyone in that airport to understand that when you disrespect our veterans, the armed forces respond. It'll be my honor. I'm going personally. Sullivan sat uncomfortably in his cramped seat, trying to adjust his position to alleviate the pressure on his back. The pain was intensifying, radiating from the old wounds near his spine. He reached into his pocket for his pain medication, but his hands betrayed him. The small pill bottle fell scattering white tablets across the floor. No one moved to help him. The teenager beside him turned up his music. The woman on his other side pretended not to notice. Sullivan began to bend forward, pain shooting through his back as he tried to reach for the fallen pills. Sir, let me get those for you. David Reynolds knelt in the aisle, quickly gathering the medication. Thank you, son, Sullivan said, accepting the pills. Sir, can I get you some water for those? Sullivan nodded, grateful for the small kindness. As David went to fetch water, Sullivan noticed the dog tags hanging around the young man's neck. Not standard issue current military, but older ones. His father's, most likely. David returned with water and handed it to Sullivan. My father was a Marine, Iraq, 2003. Was, Sullivan asked gently. He came home, but not all of him. David's voice dropped. PTSD. He's gone now. Sullivan nodded in understanding. I'm sorry, son. He'd be ashamed of how we're treating you today, sir. I'm ashamed. Sullivan took his medication and looked at the young man. What's your name again, son? David Reynolds, sir. Well, David Reynolds, you've got nothing to be ashamed of. You're doing right by your father today. David straightened slightly at the words, his posture unconsciously shifting to military bearing. Thank you, sir. I should get back to work, but is there anything else I can get you? I'll be fine. Sullivan gestured to the seat. Not my first uncomfortable position. As David moved away, Sullivan closed his eyes, memories washing over him. The discomfort of the seat faded as his mind traveled back to Quezon, 1968. The smell hit him first in the memory-wet earth after rain gunpowder and the metallic scent of blood. Then the sounds, distant artillery, the crackle of radio communication, and the moans of the wounded. Captain Robert Sullivan, 27 years old, crouched behind a fallen tree, assessing the situation. Delta Company 4 to 7 had walked into an ambush. They were pinned down, separated from the main force. 7 men wounded, including Sergeant James Martinez. The extraction point was nearly a mile away through territory swarming with enemy forces. We're not going to make it, Captain, Lieutenant Davis whispered, his face streaked with mud and fear. Sullivan checked his watch, the Omega that would later bear the inscription of gratitude. We've got 90 minutes until the helicopters leave. We're all going home today. Sir Martinez can't walk. Peterson's losing blood fast. Cooper might be blind. Sullivan looked each man in the eye. No one gets left behind. No one. In the end, Sullivan carried Martinez himself, the sergeant's arm draped over his shoulder, half dragging, half carrying the wounded man through jungle and across exposed terrain as bullets whizzed past. The others helped those who could walk, forming a ragged line of determination. When a mortar round exploded nearby, shrapnel tore into Sullivan's back and legs. He fell to one knee but refused to let go of Martinez. Leave me, Captain, Martinez pleaded. Save yourself. Not happening, Sergeant, Sullivan grunted, struggling back to his feet. I promised everyone's going home. That includes you. They made it to the extraction point with 5 minutes to spare, all 7 wounded accounted for. As the helicopter lifted off, Sullivan finally allowed himself to collapse from his own wounds. Later in a field hospital, Sergeant Martinez had gripped Sullivan's hand. You carried me home, Captain. My son will know your name. The memory faded as Sullivan opened his eyes, returning to the discomfort of seat 47B. He extracted a worn letter from his pocket, handwritten on official stationery. The courage you displayed not only saved 7 lives, but stands as a testament to the very best of what we are as a nation. The words penned by President Nixon when awarding the Silver Star had faded but remained legible. Sullivan carefully refolded the letter and returned it to his pocket. He looked around the cramped economy cabin at passengers absorbed in their devices, oblivious to his presence or his pain. For a moment, he wondered if America still remembered men like him at all. This seat taken, Sullivan looked up to see Marcus standing in the aisle. Thought you were up front, son. Change seats. Marcus squeezed past the woman in the aisle seat and took the spot beside his grandfather. If you're back here, I'm back here. Sullivan smiled, touched by the gesture. Your mother raised you right. You helped, Marcus replied. He lowered his voice. I made a call. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. Marcus, what did you do? Let's just say I reached out to someone who understands what the Silver Star means. You shouldn't have done that. Marcus leaned closer. Grandpa, you carried 7 men through enemy fire. You've spent your life serving others. The least this airline can do is honor your ticket as issued. Sullivan sighed. It's not worth making a fuss. It's not about the seat anymore, Marcus said firmly. It's about respect. Eleanor Miller was checking supplies in the galley when David approached her. Eleanor, we need to talk about the passenger in 47B. Not now, David. I'm busy. Do you know who he is? Eleanor sighed, her patience worn thin by worry for her son. An elderly military veteran, I assume. He's Colonel Robert Sullivan, Silver Star recipient. He saved 7 men at Khe Sanh, carrying them to safety while wounded himself. Eleanor froze. How do you know this? I Googled him. David showed her his phone screen. Look. The article showed a much younger Robert Sullivan receiving the Silver Star from President Nixon. The citation described heroism under fire that had saved 7 lives, including that of Sergeant James Martinez. Martinez, Eleanor whispered. Why does that name sound familiar? David scrolled further. His son is General James Martinez, current Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army. Eleanor's face drained of color. The man we just bumped from first class is a war hero connected to top military brass. And we put him in a middle seat in the last row with his bad back. The man can barely move, Eleanor. He dropped his pain pills and could hardly bend to pick them up. Guilt washed over Eleanor, momentarily displacing her worry for her son. Rebecca insisted we move whoever had the lowest status. Well, we just disrespected a national hero to make room for 2 businessmen who complained their original first-class seats weren't close enough together. Eleanor's tablet chimed with an incoming message. It was from the Captain Jeff Collins. Come to the flight deck immediately. I have to go, she told David. The captain wants to see me. In the cockpit, Captain Jeff Collins was holding the radio receiver, his face grim. Eleanor, I just got a call from CEO Parker himself. Mr. Parker called you directly? Eleanor's stomach dropped. Apparently, we have a VIP on board who's been mistreated, a Colonel Robert Sullivan. I just found out who he is, Eleanor admitted. The seat reassignment came from Rebecca Johnson. I was following orders. Collins nodded. Well, those orders have been countermanded from the very top. Parker wants Sullivan back in first class immediately. And Eleanor, there's more. Andrews Air Force Base just contacted Denver Tower. General Martinez and a military delegation are en route to the airport right now. Eleanor stared in disbelief. A general is coming because we changed someone's seat. Not just someone. Collins handed her a printout. Read his citation. Eleanor scanned the document, her hands trembling. The words blurred before her eyes, but phrases stood out. Under heavy enemy fire. Carried 7 wounded men, despite severe injuries to himself. Extraordinary heroism. Oh my God, she whispered. That's not all, Collins said, his voice softening. Parker mentioned your son, Kevin Miller, right? Wounded in Afghanistan. Eleanor nodded, tears welling in her eyes. He's at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. Stable condition. He was evacuated using a trauma protocol developed by, guess who? Colonel Sullivan, Eleanor's voice cracked. Collins nodded. Sullivan pioneered battlefield evacuation techniques that are still saving lives today, including possibly your son's. Eleanor steadied herself against the cockpit wall. What do we do now? Fix this, Collins said simply. Fix it now. At Denver International Airport, the sound was unmistakable. Military boots marching in perfect synchrony across the terminal's marble floor. Passengers paused and turned to watch. General Graham Ford 62 led the way, flanked by 6 uniformed service members representing different branches of the military. Their uniforms were crisp, their insignias gleaming, their posture flawless. They moved through the terminal with purpose in unity. Airport staff stepped aside respectfully. Children pointed in awe. Adults whispered, trying to make sense of the scene. At gate B-17, the gate agent looked up from her computer, eyes widening at the approaching military delegation. "I'm General Ford, United States Air Force," Ford announced. "We're here about Flight 257 to Washington. The flight is fully boarded, sir. They're preparing for departure. I need to speak with someone from the flight crew immediately." Inside the aircraft, passengers murmured as they noticed the military presence gathering outside. Some began filming with their phones, sensing something significant was about to happen. The cabin intercom crackled to life. Captain Collins's voice filled the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a special situation developing. I've just learned that we have the honor of having Colonel Robert Sullivan, Silver Star recipient, on our flight today." A hush fell over the cabin as passengers looked around, trying to identify the mentioned hero. "Colonel Sullivan," Collins continued, "served our country with distinction. Through an unfortunate error in our seating assignment, Colonel Sullivan was moved from his assigned first-class seat. We will be correcting this situation immediately." Sullivan, still wedged uncomfortably in seat 47B, felt all eyes turning toward him. Marcus squeezed his grandfather's arm supportively. The cabin door reopened. Eleanor Miller entered, followed by David Reynolds. They walked directly to Sullivan's row. "Colonel Sullivan," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion, "on behalf of American Eagle Airlines, I want to personally apologize for the disrespect you've experienced today. Your first-class seat is waiting for you, sir." Sullivan looked at her, noting the red-rimmed eyes and genuine remorse in her expression. "I understand you have a son serving, ma'am," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" "A mother knows that look," Sullivan said. "I had 3 sons serve. I know the worry in a military parent's eyes." "He's been wounded," Eleanor admitted, "in Afghanistan." Sullivan nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Sir," Eleanor continued, "they're using a trauma protocol with his name on it. The Sullivan method for battlefield evacuation." For the first time since boarding, genuine surprise registered on Sullivan's face. "They still use that old system." "They do, sir, and the captain just informed me that my son is stable because of it." Sullivan slowly rose from his seat, wincing as his back protested. "Then I'd say we're even, ma'am." "No, sir," Eleanor said firmly. "We're not even close to even." As Sullivan moved into the aisle, leaning slightly on Marcus for support, something remarkable happened. A passenger in the front row stood up, a Korea veteran according to his cap. He snapped to attention, offering a crisp salute. Then another passenger stood, and another. Soon every veteran on the plane was standing, honoring the Silver Star recipient in their midst. Sullivan walked slowly toward the front of the aircraft, acknowledging each salute with a nod. When he reached the first-class cabin, he found the 2 businessmen who had taken his seat standing awkwardly in the aisle. "Colonel," one of them said, extending his hand, "please take your seat. It's an honor to meet you." Sullivan settled into seat 5A, relief washing over his features as the pressure eased from his back. Eleanor personally adjusted the seat for maximum comfort and brought him a pillow specifically designed for lumbar support. The cabin door opened once more. General Ford entered, followed by his military escort. The 6 service members lined the aisle at attention as Ford approached Sullivan. "Colonel Sullivan," Ford said, his voice carrying throughout the now silent aircraft. "I'm General Graham Ford, United States Air Force. On behalf of the armed forces, I apologize for the way you were treated today." Sullivan blinked, still trying to grasp the situation. "That's not necessary, General." "It absolutely is, Colonel." Ford stood at attention and saluted. The 6 service members did the same. Every passenger watched in silent respect as an 84-year-old hero received the honor he had earned decades ago and never demanded for himself. As General Ford prepared to leave, he leaned down and spoke quietly to Sullivan. "General Martinez sends his regards. He said to tell you that his father's debt is still being paid forward, 1 Sullivan at a time." Sullivan nodded, emotion briefly overcoming his usual stoicism. "Thank you for coming, General." "The honor is ours, Colonel." As the military delegation departed, Captain Collins made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be departing shortly. It's not every day we have the privilege of flying with a true American hero. Today we are reminded of the price of freedom and the value of respect." Sullivan gazed out the window at the mountains beyond Denver. In their unchanging presence, he found a strange comfort. Mountains endured. Perhaps some values could endure as well. He placed his hand over the pocket containing his silver star. Not for glory, not for recognition, but as a reminder of promises kept and men brought home. Marcus appeared beside him. Everything good, Grandpa. Sullivan looked up at his grandson, seeing in him the future of service and sacrifice. Everything's as it should be now, son. Everything's as it should be. Colonel Robert Sullivan gazed out the airplane window as the Rocky Mountains receded into the distance. The leather first-class seat cradled his aching back, a small mercy after decades of pain. The events of the past hours seemed almost dreamlike, a public humiliation transformed into an unexpected tribute. Sullivan reached into his breast pocket and withdrew an aged, creased letter. The presidential letterhead had yellowed with time, but the words remained clear. His weathered fingers traced the handwritten note from President Nixon that accompanied his silver star. Your courage not only saved 7 lives, but stands as a testament to the very best of what we are as a nation. A flight attendant approached with a glass of water. Not Eleanor Miller, who had retreated to the galley to compose herself, but a younger woman with a newfound reverence in her eyes. Is there anything else I can get for you, Colonel? Sullivan looked up, momentarily pulled from his thoughts. No, thank you. I'm fine. As she walked away, Sullivan returned to the letter, his mind drifting to a question that had haunted him with increasing frequency in recent years. Did America still value the ideals he had fought for? In a world obsessed with status and wealth, did sacrifice and duty still matter? He watched the businessmen who had initially taken his seat. They were now seated several rows back, absorbed in their laptops and spreadsheets, perhaps calculating profits or planning acquisitions. There was no malice in them. They simply existed in a different America than the one Sullivan had bled for. Sullivan's gnarled fingers closed around the small metal object in his pocket, the piece of shrapnel doctors had removed from his back in 1969. Sergeant Martinez had later had it polished and engraved, "To steady Sullivan, you carried me home." It served as a tactile reminder of promises kept. The intercom crackled to life. Captain Collins's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for cruising altitude. Flight time to Washington, D.C. will be approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. Our estimated arrival time is 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Sullivan checked his watch, the old Omega still keeping perfect time after all these years. He would have several hours before the Pentagon ceremony. Time enough to gather his thoughts, perhaps revise his speech. In the galley, Eleanor Miller pressed a cold napkin to her eyes, trying to regain her composure. Her phone vibrated with a text message from the military hospital in Germany. PFC Miller, stable after surgery. Doctor will call within the hour. Her son was alive. The Sullivan method for battlefield evacuation had helped save him, and she had repaid that debt by humiliating the very man responsible. David Reynolds appeared beside her. Eleanor, are you okay? My son's stable, she whispered. He's going to live. David nodded. That's good news. I nearly lost him the same day I disrespected the man whose protocols saved him. Eleanor shook her head at the cruel irony. What are the odds? Maybe it's not coincidence, David suggested. My father used to say there are no accidents in a life of service. Eleanor studied the young man. Your father was a Marine. Iraq, 2003. He came home with PTSD, lost his battle 2 years ago. David touched the dog tags around his neck. That's why I recognize Colonel Sullivan's Silver Star pin. My dad made sure I knew what it meant. And I moved him to make room for platinum members, Eleanor said bitterly. You were following orders. That excuse didn't work at Nuremberg, and it doesn't work now. Eleanor straightened her uniform. I need to check on the colonel again. In Washington, D.C., CEO William Parker's office overlooked the Capitol's iconic landmarks. The view had cost millions but seemed worthless as Parker paced behind his mahogany desk phone pressed to his ear. Tell me everything's been fixed, Jeff, Parker demanded of Captain Collins. Colonel Sullivan is back in first class, sir. General Ford personally came aboard to apologize. The situation has been resolved. The situation should never have happened, Parker snapped. Who authorized Bumblula Silver Star recipient? Customer Service VP Rebecca Johnson issued a directive to prioritize high-status frequent flyers over all other passengers. No exceptions. Parker rubbed his temples. 20 years in the Air Force before entering the business world had instilled in him a reverence for military decorations. A silver star wasn't just a piece of metal, it represented courage and sacrifice most people couldn't begin to comprehend. "I want Johnson in my office the moment this flight lands," Parker said, "and I want to know how this happened." "Yes, sir." "And Jeff, take care of Sullivan, whatever he needs." "Already on it, sir." Parker ended the call and turned to his computer. He pulled up the personnel file for Rebecca Johnson, Customer Service Vice President, Yale MBA, fast track through management, 15 years with the company, doubled customer retention rates, implemented the Platinum Loyalty Program that had generated millions in revenue. Then Parker noticed something curious, a gap in Johnson's employment history. 5 years unaccounted for between college and her first corporate position. He scrolled further, looking for personal information. Father James Johnson, military service, USMC. Parker's brow furrowed. Rebecca Johnson was the daughter of a North Korea veteran, yet she had authorized the displacement of a decorated North Korea hero. Something didn't add up. His secretary buzzed through the intercom. "Sir General Martinez is on line 1. Parker picked up immediately. "James, is this about Sullivan?" "It is." General Martinez's voice was grave. "I've known Robert Sullivan my entire life, Bill. My father wouldn't have lived to see my birth if not for him. I've issued orders to correct the situation. It's not enough." Martinez's tone left no room for negotiation. "Sullivan carried my father through hell. He's carried the shrapnel in his back for 50 years without complaint. And your airline couldn't even honor his ticket." Parker recognized the steel in the general's voice. It mirrored his own feelings. "I'm implementing a new policy immediately. No veteran with a silver star or higher will ever be bumped again." "Make it all veterans," Martinez countered, "starting with Sullivan." "Agreed, and James, thank you for bringing this to my attention." "My father made me promise something when I was 12 years old," Martinez said. "He said, if you ever get the chance to repay Bob Sullivan, you take it. Today I'm keeping that promise." The call ended, leaving Parker with a renewed sense of purpose. He pressed the intercom button. "Margaret, cancel all my appointments for the rest of the day. I'm drafting a new company policy." At Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, General Ford returned from Denver Airport, gathering his team in the briefing room. "Mission accomplished, sir," asked Captain Rodriguez, one of the 6 service members who had accompanied Ford to the airport. "Sullivan is back where he belongs," Ford confirmed. "But this isn't over." "What's our next move, sir?" Ford smiled, a rare expression on his normally stern face. "We're going to meet that plane when it lands." In the aircraft's first-class cabin, Sullivan dozed lightly, the comfort of the seat allowing him a rare moment of pain-free rest. In his dreams, he was back in Quezon, 1968, rain soaking through his uniform as he assessed his wounded men. Sergeant Martinez lay on the ground, blood seeping from a wound in his thigh. The extraction point was over a mile away across terrain, crawling with enemy forces. "Leave me, Captain," Martinez urged through gritted teeth. "Save the others." Sullivan crouched beside him. "That's not how we operate, Sergeant." "I can't walk." "Then I'll carry you." In the dream, Sullivan hoisted Martinez onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry. The sergeant wasn't a small man, 200 pounds of muscle and gear. Sullivan's legs trembled under the weight, but his resolve never wavered. They moved through the jungle, Sullivan navigating by compass while carrying Martinez. The other wounded were supported by the remaining able-bodied men of Delta 47. Every few hundred yards, Sullivan would adjust Martinez's position, ignoring the growing fatigue in his muscles. "Why are you doing this?" Martinez asked, his voice weak from blood loss. "Because we all go home," Sullivan answered. "Every last one of us." When enemy fire erupted from a hidden position, Sullivan didn't drop his burden. He kept moving even as white-hot pain tore through his back and leg. Shrapnel embedded itself deep in his tissues, but Sullivan refused to fall. "I'm hit," he grunted. "Drop me," Martinez pleaded. "Not happening, Sergeant." Sullivan pushed forward each step in exercise and determination. Blood soaked through his uniform, both his and Martinez's, but he maintained his pace. The extraction point appeared ahead, a small clearing where helicopters would land. When they finally reached safety, Sullivan gently lowered Martinez to the ground where medics waited. Only then did he allow himself to acknowledge his own wounds. As he collapsed, Martinez grabbed his hand. "My son will know what you did today," Martinez promised. My son will remember. Sullivan awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. The dream had been so vivid, not a dream at all, but a memory. He checked his watch. They had been airborne for almost 2 hours. Eleanor appeared at his side. "Colonel, I thought you might like to know we've received word about my son." Sullivan straightened in his seat. "How is he? Stable? Out of surgery?" Her voice caught. "They used your evacuation protocol. The doctor called it the Sullivan method." A look of genuine surprise crossed Sullivan's weathered face. "They still use that old system?" "They do. The doctor said it saved precious minutes. Those minutes saved my son." Eleanor's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "I can never apologize enough for what happened earlier." Sullivan studied her face. "Your son has a good mother. That's what matters now." "Thank you, sir." Eleanor hesitated. "There's something else. Captain Collins would like to speak with you when you have a moment." Sullivan nodded, curious. "Send him back." Eleanor disappeared toward the cockpit. Minutes later, Captain Jeff Collins emerged. The pilot was in his early 50s, with the trimmed mustache and confident bearing of a career military man. Collins approached Sullivan's seat and extended his hand. "Colonel Sullivan, Jeff Collins, former F-18 pilot, Navy." Sullivan shook the offered hand. "Navy, eh? You boys always had the better toys." Collins smiled at the good-natured military rivalry. "That we did, sir." His expression turned serious. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened. It's not what our airline stands for." "I appreciate that, Captain." "There's more," Collins continued. "CEO Parker called me directly when he heard what happened. He's a Gulf War vet himself. He wanted me to tell you that by the time we land, there will be a new company policy in place. The Sullivan Protocol." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Protocol?" "Guaranteeing that no military veteran, especially decorated combat veterans, will ever be bumped from their assigned seats again." Collins lowered his voice. "And I think you might find a welcoming committee when we land." Sullivan nodded, uncomfortable with the attention, but moved by the gesture. "Thank you for telling me." As Collins returned to the cockpit, David Reynolds approached with a cup of coffee. "Black, no sugar," David said, placing it carefully on Sullivan's tray. "Marcus mentioned that's how you take it." "Thank you, son." Sullivan accepted the coffee. "Your father was a Marine?" "Yes, sir. Iraq War, 2 tours." Sullivan nodded. "Tough business." "He used to tell me stories about the old veterans," David said. "Men like you. He said you all set the standard that we tried to live up to." "Every generation has its heroes," Sullivan replied. "Your father among them." David touched the dog tags around his neck. "He'd be ashamed of how we treated you today." "No," Sullivan said firmly. "He'd be proud of how you're making it right. That's what counts in the end." In the economy section, Marcus Sullivan observed the interaction from afar. His phone buzzed with a text message from General Martinez. "Landing party arranged. Your grandfather won't believe this." Marcus smiled. The military took care of its own, even decades after service. An hour later, the aircraft began its descent into Washington, D.C. Captain Collins's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach to Reagan National Airport. Current weather is clear skies, temperature 72 degrees. We should be on the ground in about 20 minutes." Sullivan gazed out the window as the nation's capital came into view. The Washington Monument stood like a sentinel, the Capitol Dome gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the Lincoln Memorial reflected in the tidal basin. This city had sent him and countless others to war. Some returned, many didn't. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Eleanor said, noticing his gaze. "It is," Sullivan agreed. "Worth protecting." Eleanor adjusted his seat for landing. "Colonel, I should tell you there's been a lot of activity on social media about what happened today." A passenger recorded video of General Ford coming aboard. Sullivan frowned. "I don't need or want publicity." "I understand, sir, but some things take on a life of their own." As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Sullivan prepared himself for the usual disembarkation chaos. Instead, Captain Collins made an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special request. As a sign of respect, we ask that you remain seated to allow Colonel Sullivan to deplane first. It's a small gesture to honor his service to our nation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. When the aircraft door opened, Sullivan rose slowly, assisted by Marcus, who had moved forward to join his grandfather. "What's going on?" Sullivan whispered to his grandson. Just a proper welcome, Grandpa, Marcus replied with a smile. Sullivan stepped from the jetway into the terminal and froze in astonishment. Lining both sides of the corridor stood dozens of military personnel in full-dress uniform. Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard representatives from every branch formed an honor corridor. At the end stood General James Martinez, now silver-haired, but still ramrod straight in his Army uniform adorned with the stars of his rank. As Sullivan appeared, a command rang out, "Attention!" In perfect unison, every service member snapped to attention and saluted. Sullivan stood motionless, overwhelmed. This wasn't protocol for a retired colonel. This level of ceremony was reserved for the highest dignitaries. General Martinez stepped forward. "Colonel Sullivan, welcome to Washington." Sullivan managed to find his voice. "James, this is unexpected." Martinez smiled. 57 years ago, you carried my father through hell to bring him home. Today we honor that debt." Sullivan shook his head. "No debt was ever owed." "My father disagreed," Martinez replied. "His last words to me were, 'Remember Sullivan, I've never forgotten.'" Martinez reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. "This belonged to my father. He wanted you to have it." Sullivan opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside lay a bullet casing polished to a high shine mounted on a base of polished wood. Engraved on the side were the words, "To the man who carried me home, Martinez Sr." Sullivan swallowed hard emotion, threatening to break through his composed exterior. "Your father was a good man, James, one of the best I ever served with. He said the same about you." Martinez turned to address the assembled service members. "This is what we mean by leave no one behind." Colonel Sullivan lived that creed not just in war, but for his entire life. "Today, we return the honor." The gathered military personnel responded with a thunderous "hooah" that echoed through the terminal. Civilian travelers stopped to watch, many recording the scene on their phones. Near the back of the assembly, CEO William Parker observed the scene in his tailored suit, the American Eagle logo pin on his lapel, complemented by a small Gulf War service pin. Beside him stood Rebecca Johnson, her face an unreadable mask. "That's Sullivan," Johnson asked quietly. "That's him," Parker confirmed. "The man your employee bumped to economy." Johnson watched the elderly veteran receiving military honors with an expression that gradually shifted from professional detachment to something more complex. "Is that his grandson?" she asked, noticing Marcus standing proudly beside Sullivan. "Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan, United States Marines." Parker studied Johnson's reaction. Third-generation military family. Something flickered in Johnson's eyes, a pain quickly suppressed. "I need to speak with them both." "Not yet," Parker cautioned. "Let them have this moment." The honor guard parted as Sullivan and Martinez walked through the terminal, a half-century of shared history between them. Travelers applauded spontaneously, though few understood the full significance of what they were witnessing. Sullivan leaned toward Martinez. "This is too much, James." "It's not nearly enough," Martinez responded. "Do you know how many men in this honor guard are sons and grandsons of North Korea veterans? They know who you are, what you represent." As they approached the terminal exit, Sullivan was surprised to see Eleanor Miller, waiting her uniform immaculate despite her emotional day. "Colonel Sullivan," she said formally, "on behalf of American Eagle Airlines, I want to extend our deepest apologies again and offer you our executive transportation service to your hotel." Sullivan shook his head. "That's not necessary." "Please," Eleanor insisted. "It would mean a great deal to me." Sullivan relented, recognizing the importance of allowing others to make amends. "Very well." As they walked toward the waiting vehicle, Sullivan noticed David Reynolds standing nearby in conversation with CEO Parker. The young man straightened instinctively when Sullivan approached. "Mr. Reynolds," Sullivan acknowledged, "thank you for your kindness today." David nodded respectfully. "It was an honor, sir." "Take care of those tags," Sullivan said, gesturing to the dog tags around David's neck. "They're more valuable than any executive bonus." "Yes, sir, I know that now." Parker stepped forward, extending his hand. "Colonel Sullivan, William Parker. I served in the Air Force during Desert Storm." "Gulf War," Sullivan nodded. "Different sandbox, same mission." "I want you to know that what happened today has already led to permanent changes in our company policy. The Sullivan Protocol will ensure that no veteran ever experiences such disrespect on our airlines again." Sullivan accepted the handshake but deflected the recognition. "Name it after Sergeant Martinez. He's the one who didn't make it home to see his grandson graduate from West Point." Parker nodded, understanding the deflection for what it was: not false modesty, but a genuine belief that Sullivan had simply done his duty. I'll take that under advisement, Colonel. As Sullivan prepared to leave with Eleanor and Marcus, Rebecca Johnson approached, her professional poise now visibly strained. Colonel Sullivan, she said, her voice unexpectedly tight. I'm Rebecca Johnson, Vice President of Customer Service at American Eagle. Sullivan studied her face, noting a familiar tension around her eyes. Miss Johnson, the directive to prioritize Platinum members came from my office. I take full responsibility for what happened today. Sullivan nodded, accepting her statement without comment. Rebecca hesitated, then reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a faded military patch, 1st Marine Division. My father was James Johnson. Sullivan's eyes softened with recognition. I knew a Johnson in the 1st Marines. Sniper, if I recall. That was him. Rebecca's professional veneer cracked further. He came home with PTSD, took his own life when I was 16. Sullivan's expression remained composed, but his eyes reflected understanding. I'm sorry for your loss, Ms. Johnson. I buried that part of my life, Rebecca admitted. Built my career as far from the military as possible. I've spent 20 years pretending that world doesn't exist. And today it found you anyway, Sullivan observed quietly. Rebecca nodded. When I saw the footage of you being honored, I recognized something: the way you stand, the way you speak. It reminded me of him before the nightmares took over. Sullivan remained silent, allowing her the space to continue. I've been so angry at the military for so long, Rebecca said. I blamed it for destroying him. But watching you today, I realized I've been dishonoring his memory all these years. Sullivan finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. Your father's service was honorable, Ms. Johnson. His struggle afterward doesn't diminish that. Neither does your pain. Rebecca wiped away an unexpected tear. Thank you, Colonel. I'd like to be part of implementing the new protocol if Mr. Parker agrees. I think that would be appropriate, Sullivan said with a nod to Parker, who stood nearby. As Rebecca moved away, visibly affected by the encounter, Marcus leaned toward his grandfather. You knew her father. I knew of him, Sullivan corrected. The Marine snipers were legendary. Every grunt knew their names. Eleanor guided Sullivan and Marcus toward the waiting executive car. Your hotel has been upgraded to a suite, Colonel, CEO's orders. Sullivan shook his head in mild protest. All this fuss over an old soldier. Not just any soldier, Grandpa, Marcus said proudly. As they settled into the luxury vehicle, Sullivan gazed out at the Washington landmarks passing by. The World War II Memorial, the Veterans Memorial where too many names of friends were etched in somber stone, the Lincoln Memorial with its timeless message of healing national wounds. You know, Sullivan said thoughtfully, when I was your age, Marcus, I never imagined I'd live to be an old man. In the jungle, tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. But you made it, Grandpa, and you brought others home too. Sullivan nodded, his mind drifting back to rain-soaked jungle paths and the weight of Sergeant Martinez on his shoulders. We did what had to be done. Eleanor, sitting across from them, hesitated before speaking. Colonel, may I ask you something personal? You may try, Sullivan replied with the hint of a smile. How did you do it? Carry a wounded man through enemy territory while wounded yourself? Sullivan considered the question not as trivial as it might seem. One step at a time, Miss Miller. Just one step at a time. The car pulled up to the Willard Intercontinental Hotel, one of Washington's most prestigious addresses. A uniformed doorman opened the car door. This isn't the hotel I booked, Sullivan noted. Upgrade courtesy of American Eagle, Eleanor explained. Your reservation has been transferred and extended. The presidential suite is prepared for you. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. Presidential suite for a retired colonel. For a Silver Star recipient, Eleanor corrected. It's the least we can do. As Sullivan entered the historic hotel lobby, the manager approached immediately. Colonel Sullivan, welcome to the Willard. It's an honor to have you with us. Sullivan shook the offered hand, increasingly bemused by the attention. Thank you. Your suite is ready, sir. And there's a package waiting for you. Delivered by military courier an hour ago. In the presidential suite, a space larger than Sullivan's entire Kansas home, Marcus whistled appreciatively at the opulent surroundings. Grandpa, I think you've been upgraded, Sullivan chuckled, setting a small suitcase down. Apparently so. The mysterious package sat on an ornate writing desk, a flat rectangular box wrapped in simple brown paper with official Defense Department seals. Sullivan opened it carefully. Inside lay a silver picture frame containing a photograph he hadn't seen in decades, the full Delta Company 47, taken just days before the Quezon ambush. Young faces stared back at the camera, unaware of what awaited them. In the center stood a younger Sullivan, his arm around Sergeant Martinez. A note accompanied the photograph. They remember. We all do. J.M. Sullivan's weathered hand traced the faces of men long gone. Of the 32 soldiers in the photograph, 11 never returned home. 7 more were carried out by Sullivan during that fateful ambush. Eleanor, who had accompanied them to ensure the accommodations were satisfactory, noticed Sullivan's expression. "Is everything all right, Colonel?" Sullivan nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He cleared his throat. "Just some old memories. Good ones, I hope?" "The best kind," Sullivan replied. "The kind that reminds you why it all mattered." Eleanor checked her phone. "I should be going. The car will be available to you throughout your stay, Colonel. Just call whenever you need it." As she turned to leave, Sullivan spoke. "Ms. Miller." She paused. "Yes, Colonel." "Thank you, and I hope your son heals quickly." Eleanor smiled gratefully. "The hospital says he'll be transferred back to the States next week. They're using your methods for his recovery, too." After she departed, Sullivan sat heavily in an ornate chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 84 years. The day's events had drained him more than he cared to admit. Marcus brought him a glass of water. "You should rest before the ceremony, Grandpa." Sullivan nodded, but his mind was already drifting to the speech he would deliver later at the Pentagon. The prepared remarks now seemed inadequate after the day's events. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and read through the carefully crafted words about leadership and duty. "Something wrong with the speech?" Marcus asked, noticing his grandfather's frown. "It doesn't say what needs saying anymore," Sullivan replied. "What's that?" Sullivan gazed out the hotel window at the Washington Monument standing tall against the afternoon sky. "That honor isn't something you receive with a medal. It's something you live with every day, especially when no one is watching." Marcus nodded, understanding. "Then that's what you should say." Sullivan smiled at his grandson. "Maybe I will." He reached again for the silver star in his pocket, the weight of it familiar after all these years. Not a burden, but a reminder. Not of glory, but of promises kept. Outside the hotel window, Washington continued its eternal bustle of power and politics. But in that quiet room, an old soldier prepared to deliver one final mission brief. Not about war, but about what makes a life worth living. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the Willard Hotel's presidential suite, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Colonel Robert Sullivan stood before the ornate mirror, adjusting his tie with fingers that had once field-stripped an M16 in complete darkness. The reflection that stared back at him was both familiar and strange. An old man in a dark suit, silver hair neatly combed, the quiet dignity of age settled in the lines of his face. From the adjoining room, Marcus emerged in his marine dress blues, the gold buttons gleaming against the midnight fabric. "Almost ready, Grandpa." Sullivan nodded, reaching for the small wooden box on the dresser. Inside nestled his silver star, rarely removed from its resting place. Today, however, was different. Today he would speak at the Pentagon about leadership in crisis. Today, though, the medal would serve its purpose, not as a symbol of personal glory, but as a tangible reminder of what ordinary men could accomplish when the moment demanded extraordinary courage. Sullivan pinned the silver star to his lapel, the weight of it negligible, yet somehow profound. "You look sharp," Marcus said, pride evident in his voice. "Like you could still command a company." Sullivan smiled faintly. "The mind might be willing, but the knees would object." A knock at the door announced their transportation. The executive car from American Eagle Airlines waited below part of the company's ongoing atonement. Eleanor Miller stood in the hallway, not in her flight attendant uniform, but in a conservative dark blue dress, her posture professional, but her eyes warmer than they had been on the plane. "Colonel Sullivan, the car is ready whenever you are." Sullivan nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Miller, though this continued attention isn't necessary." "It's my pleasure, sir. I've been assigned as your liaison for the duration of your stay." As they descended in the elevator, Eleanor hesitated before speaking. "Colonel, there's something else. My son Kevin, he's being transferred to Walter Reed tomorrow. The doctors say your evacuation protocol saved his life." Sullivan looked at the woman, seeing behind her professional demeanor to the worried mother beneath. "I'd like to visit him if that's acceptable." Eleanor's composure wavered momentarily. "He would be honored, sir. He's asked about you." The Blacktown car glided through Washington traffic toward the Pentagon. Sullivan gazed out the window watching the capital city pass by. So much had changed since his first visit as a newly commissioned lieutenant in 1962. The buildings were taller, the streets busier, the pace of life accelerated beyond what anyone from his generation could have imagined. Yet the monuments remained steadfast stone sentinels guarding the ideals of a nation. "Nervous about the speech, Grandpa?" Marcus asked. Sullivan shook his head. "I've faced enemy fire. Words hold little terror after that." At the Pentagon's secure entrance, a military aide in dress uniform awaited their arrival. "Colonel Sullivan, welcome to the Pentagon. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. I'll escort you to the ceremony." Sullivan recognized the respect in the younger officer's eyes, not merely the deference due to age, but the genuine regard of one warrior for another. They walked through the massive building's corridors, Sullivan moving with the deliberate pace of a man whose body had endured more than its share of damage in service to country. The memorial auditorium was filled to capacity. High-ranking officers from all branches, defense officials, and distinguished guests turned as Sullivan entered. In the front row sat General James Martinez, resplendent in his army dress uniform, adorned with the stars of his rank. Beside him, a space was reserved for Sullivan. As Sullivan made his way down the aisle, something remarkable happened. Without command or announcement, every military person in the room rose and came to attention. The civilian guests, sensing the significance of the moment, stood as well. Sullivan walked through this impromptu honor guard, his face impassive though his heart raced. This was not protocol for a retired colonel. This level of respect was typically reserved for the highest commanders and dignitaries. Yet here it was freely given, spontaneous tribute from one generation of warriors to another. Martinez stepped forward to greet him, extending his hand. The handshake between them carried the weight of a shared history that transcended the half-century. "They're all here for you, Bob," Martinez said quietly. Sullivan shook his head slightly. "Not for me, for what we represented, for what we did together." The Secretary of Defense himself approached the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Operation Spring 1975. But we are especially honored to have with us a man whose courage in an earlier chapter of that conflict exemplifies the very best of American military tradition. Colonel Robert Sullivan's actions at Khe Sanh in 1968 saved 7 lives and earned him the Silver Star. But perhaps more importantly, they established a standard of leadership that continues to inspire today's armed forces." Sullivan listened, outwardly composed while inwardly uncomfortable with such praise. He had never sought recognition, had never considered his actions extraordinary. He had simply done what the moment required, what his men deserved. "Colonel Sullivan," the secretary continued, "would you honor us with your thoughts on leadership in crisis?" Sullivan approached the podium, removing from his pocket the speech he had prepared weeks ago. He glanced at the carefully typed words, then folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "I had a speech prepared," Sullivan began, his voice strong despite his years. "Words about tactics and strategy, about decision-making under pressure. But something happened yesterday that changed my perspective." A ripple of interest moved through the audience. Many had already heard about the airplane incident through social media and military channels. "Yesterday, I boarded a plane with a first-class ticket provided by this very department. Due to what the airline called operational issues, I was reassigned to economy class." Sullivan paused. At 84, with a back full of shrapnel, courtesy of Khe Sanh, this wasn't merely inconvenient, it was painful. The audience was utterly silent, captivated. But this isn't a story about airline seating. It's about what happened next. "My grandson, Lieutenant Marcus Sullivan of the United States Marines." Sullivan gestured to Marcus, who sat at attention in the front row. "Made a phone call. That call reached General Martinez, who reached others still. Before the plane could depart, a general officer and a military honor guard arrived at the gate." Sullivan turned slightly to acknowledge Martinez. "James here was keeping a promise made to his father, Sergeant James Martinez Sr., one of the 7 men I carried out of that jungle in '68. Martinez nodded, emotion evident in his usually stoic expression. "What struck me wasn't the correction of the seating arrangement," Sullivan continued. "It was the unbroken chain of honor that connected a young sergeant to his son, now a general, to the men and women who dropped everything to stand up for an old soldier they'd never met." Sullivan paused, scanning the faces before him. Young officers who had never known the jungle's senior commanders who had served in different deserts and mountains, defense officials who made decisions affecting lives around the globe. This Silver Star Sullivan touched the medal on his lapel isn't about me. It never was. It's about a promise. The promise that we leave no one behind. Not on the battlefield, not on an airplane, not in life. The room remained hushed, hanging on his every word. Leadership in crisis isn't about rank or authority. It's about remembering who we are in our worst moments. It's about carrying each other when the burden becomes too great for one person to bear. Sullivan's voice softened slightly. In Quezon, I carried Sergeant Martinez because he couldn't walk. Yesterday, his son carried my honor, when others discarded it as inconvenient. That's not coincidence. That's the legacy of service. That's the unbroken chain that connects us all. The old colonel straightened his shoulders, ignoring the familiar pain that radiated from his spine. We often speak of leaving no one behind in combat, but what does that mean when we've all come home? What does that promise require of us in boardrooms, in airplane cabins, in everyday life? Sullivan looked directly at the highest-ranking officials in the front row. It means remembering that the uniform may come off, but the commitment never does. It means recognizing that honor isn't something you receive with a medal. Honor is how you live when nobody's watching. Honor is how you treat the person who can't do anything for you in return. The weight of his words settled over the room like a benediction. I didn't do anything special in that jungle. I simply refused to break a promise. And yesterday, a new generation refused to break theirs. That's all the leadership philosophy you need. Sullivan stepped away from the podium, the silence in the room absolute before it erupted into thunderous applause. Officers who had commanded thousands, who had orchestrated complex military operations across the globe, stood to honor a simple truth spoken by an old soldier. The Secretary of Defense approached Sullivan, shaking his hand vigorously. That wasn't the speech we expected, Colonel, but it was the one we needed to hear. As Sullivan returned to his seat beside Martinez, the general leaned over. My father would have been proud, Bob, of both of us. Sullivan nodded, understanding the full weight of those words. After the ceremony, a reception was held in one of the Pentagon's ornate halls. Military officers and defense officials clustered around Sullivan, each wanting a moment with the man whose unscripted words had cut through layers of protocol and procedure to the heart of military service. Among the guests, Sullivan was surprised to see William Parker, the CEO of American Eagle Airlines, in conversation with Eleanor Miller and Rebecca Johnson. Parker approached Sullivan with an extended hand. Colonel, your speech was extraordinary. Exactly the reminder many of us needed. Sullivan accepted the handshake. Mr. Parker, I didn't expect to see you here. The secretary invited me after hearing about yesterday's events. He thought I might benefit from your perspective. Parker gestured to Rebecca Johnson. We both did. Rebecca stepped forward, her corporate poise noticeably softened. Colonel Sullivan, I want you to know that the Sullivan Protocol has been implemented across our entire airline as of this morning. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. I suggested you name it after Sergeant Martinez. We did better than that, Parker explained. The full name is the Sullivan-Martinez Veterans Honor Protocol. Every veteran who flies with us will be treated with the respect they've earned. But more importantly, we're establishing a foundation to support veterans' families. Rebecca continued, her voice taking on a personal tone, especially families dealing with PTSD and its aftermath. In memory of my father and all those who came home carrying invisible wounds. Sullivan studied the woman's face, seeing genuine purpose where before there had been only corporate ambition. Your father would be proud, Ms. Johnson. I hope so, she replied softly. I've spent too many years running from his legacy. It's time I honored it instead. Eleanor Miller approached her phone, clutched in her hand. Colonel, I've just received word. My son has arrived at Walter Reed. He's asking if you might visit. Sullivan nodded immediately. Of course. Right now, if possible. The ride to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center was quiet. Sullivan lost in thought as the Washington landmarks gave way to the Maryland suburbs. Marcus sat beside his grandfather, occasionally glancing at the older man with undisguised admiration. You didn't use your prepared speech, Marcus observed. Sullivan shook his head. It didn't say what needed saying. The secretary seemed impressed. The secretary has never carried a wounded man through enemy territory, Sullivan replied, not unkindly. Some things you can't understand until you've lived them. At Walter Reed, they were escorted through corridors of America's wounded warriors. Sullivan moved slowly, acknowledging each service member they passed with respect that transcended rank or era. These were his brothers and sisters in arms, separated by decades but united by sacrifice. Private First Class Kevin Miller lay in a hospital bed, his left leg elevated and heavily bandaged, an IV drip in his arm. At 22, he had the fresh face of youth overlaid with the ancient eyes of those who have seen combat. His mother rushed to his side, maternal concern momentarily overriding military protocol. "Kevin, I've brought someone to meet you," Eleanor said, turning towards Sullivan. "This is Colonel Robert Sullivan." The young soldier's eyes widened. Despite his injuries, he attempted to sit straighter. "Sir, it's an honor." Sullivan approached the bed, waving away the formality. "At ease, son. How are you feeling?" "Better than yesterday, sir. The docs say I'll keep the leg. They used something called the Sullivan method during my evac. Any relation?" Sullivan nodded, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. "Something I worked out. Glad to see it's still useful." Kevin's expression grew serious. "They told me it saved crucial minutes. Those minutes saved my leg. Maybe my life." "Then it was worth developing," Sullivan said simply. They spoke for nearly an hour, not about Sullivan's past glories or Kevin's recent injuries, but about the unchanging nature of service, about fear and courage, about the brotherhood that connected a veteran to an Afghanistan soldier across half a century. Before leaving, Sullivan reached into his pocket and removed a small object, the polished bullet casing that Sergeant Martinez Sr. had given him decades ago. "I want you to have this," Sullivan said, placing it in Kevin's hand. "Sir, I couldn't—" "It's been passed from one soldier to another for 50 years, Sullivan explained. "From Martinez to me, and now to you. A reminder that you're part of something larger than yourself." Kevin closed his fingers around the memento, understanding its significance. "Thank you, sir. I'll pass it on when the time comes." As they departed Walter Reed, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. Sullivan paused, looking back at the massive hospital complex that had treated generations of America's wounded warriors. "Different wars, same sacrifices," he murmured. Eleanor, who had remained at her son's bedside, had asked the driver to take Sullivan and Marcus back to the Willard. As the car pulled away from Walter Reed, Sullivan's phone rang, an unusual occurrence for a man who rarely used the device. "Hello, Colonel Sullivan." A young woman's voice, professional but warm. "This is Margaret Chen from the Smithsonian American History Museum. I'm calling because we've been following the events of the past 2 days, and we'd like to discuss something with you. Would you be available to meet tomorrow?" Sullivan frowned slightly. "What is this regarding, Ms. Chen?" "We're developing a new permanent exhibition on American values as exemplified through military service. After what happened on your flight and the response it generated, we believe your story encapsulates exactly what we're trying to convey. We'd like to include it in some of your personal items if you're willing in the exhibition." Sullivan was momentarily speechless. The Smithsonian was the nation's attic, the keeper of America's most treasured artifacts and stories. "I'll consider it," he finally said. "Call me tomorrow." As he ended the call, Marcus looked at him questioningly. "The Smithsonian wants to put me in a museum," Sullivan explained, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Like some ancient artifact." Marcus laughed. "Not you, Grandpa. What you represent, what you stand for." Sullivan grunted noncommittally, but his mind was already turning over the possibility. Not for personal recognition that had never motivated him, but for what it might mean to future generations. Perhaps there was value in preserving not just the story of combat heroism, but the story of honor that extended long after the guns fell silent. That evening, Sullivan stood at the window of his hotel suite, gazing out at the Washington Monument, illuminated against the night sky. The events of the past 2 days had been unexpected, overwhelming in their intensity. From humiliation on an airplane to speaking at the Pentagon, from reunion with Martinez's son to meeting a young soldier saved by protocols he developed half a century ago, it was almost too much to process. His phone chimed with a text message from Eleanor. "Kevin is resting comfortably. He can't stop talking about meeting you. Thank you for the gift. He says it means more than his own medals." Sullivan set the phone aside, a mixture of emotions washing over him. Satisfaction that his improvised battlefield procedures were still saving lives. Gratitude that Martinez Sanuo had kept the promise to remember. Humility in the face of recognition he had never sought. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus opened it to find David Reynolds, the young flight attendant from American Eagle, standing in the hallway in civilian clothes, looking somewhat uncertain. "Lieutenant Sullivan, I'm sorry to intrude. I was hoping I might speak with your grandfather briefly." Marcus glanced back at Sullivan, who nodded. "Come in, Mr. Reynolds." David entered, standing at almost military attention despite his civilian attire. "Colonel, I wanted to thank you personally. Mr. Parker offered me a new position today, Director of the Veteran Service Initiative for American Eagle. I'll be overseeing implementation of the Sullivan-Martinez Protocol across the entire airline." Sullivan studied the young man. "That's quite a promotion from flight attendant." "Yes, sir. Mr. Parker said he needed someone who understood both the airline business and military values." David touched the dog tags that still hung around his neck. "Someone who wouldn't forget what matters." "Your father would be proud," Sullivan said. "I think he would," David agreed. "For the first time since losing him, I feel like I'm honoring his memory in a meaningful way." After David departed, Marcus turned to his grandfather. "You've started something, Grandpa. Something important." Sullivan shook his head slightly. "I didn't start anything. I just reminded people of what they already knew but had forgotten." The following morning brought another surprise. As Sullivan and Marcus prepared to visit the Veterans Memorial, a pilgrimage Sullivan made whenever he came to Washington, the hotel manager personally delivered a newspaper. "Colonel, I thought you might want to see this." The Washington Post featured a front-page story with the headline, "Honor Never Forgets How an Airline Incident Sparked a National Conversation About Respecting Veterans." Below it was a photograph of Sullivan being greeted by the Military Honor Guard at Reagan National Airport. Sullivan scanned the article with growing astonishment. What had begun as a personal humiliation had apparently resonated across the country. Veterans organizations were reporting an outpouring of support. Airlines beyond American Eagle were announcing their own versions of the Sullivan-Martinez Protocol. Schools were inviting veterans to speak about honor and service. "I never wanted this attention," Sullivan muttered. "Maybe that's exactly why you deserved it," Marcus replied. At the Veterans Memorial, Sullivan moved slowly along the black granite wall, his fingers occasionally reaching out to touch a name etched in the stone. So many names, so many young men who never grew old, never saw their children grow up, never experienced the fullness of the freedom they died protecting. He found the section he sought, the names from his own unit, Delta Company 47. Sullivan stood silently, remembering each face, each voice, each man as they had been in life, not just as names carved in stone. "Captain Sullivan." Sullivan turned to find an elderly man in a wheelchair, oxygen tubes in his nostrils, a North Korea veteran cap on his head. "It's Colonel now," Sullivan corrected gently. "Do I know you, Tony?" "Corporal Michael Davis, sir, Delta 47. You pulled me out of that hellhole at Khe Sanh with a bullet in my lung." Sullivan's eyes widened in recognition. "Davis? My God, I thought you were in Minnesota." "I was. Came down special when I saw the news about what happened to you on that plane. Had to see you again. Had to say thank you one more time." Sullivan knelt beside the wheelchair, ignoring the protest of his aging knees, and clasped the man's hand. Another survivor. Another life that had continued because of that desperate day in the jungle. "No thanks needed, Corporal. We all came home together. That was the promise." Davis nodded, tears in his rheumy eyes. "Never forgot it, sir. Never forgot you." As Sullivan and Davis spoke, sharing memories of comrades, both living and dead, a small crowd gathered around them. Some were tourists drawn by curiosity. Others were veterans who recognized a moment of significance. A few were school children on a field trip witnessing living history. One of the teachers approached cautiously. "Colonel Sullivan, I just wanted to say thank you. My father was in North Korea. He never talked about it until yesterday after seeing your story on the news. For the first time, he told us about his experiences, about the men he served with, about what honor meant to them." Throughout the day, similar encounters occurred. At the Lincoln Memorial, a group of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan recognized Sullivan from the news coverage and formed an impromptu honor guard. At the World War II Memorial, an elderly woman pressed a flower into his hand, whispering that her late husband had also received the Silver Star in Korea. By the time Sullivan returned to the Willard that evening, he was emotionally exhausted. The day had been filled with reminders that his story, now public in ways he had never intended, had touched something deep in the national consciousness, something about honor and remembrance that transcended politics, transcended the divisions of modern life. In his suite, Sullivan found another newspaper, USA Today, this time with a different headline, Sullivan Protocol Adopted by Major Airlines, Hotels, and Businesses Nationwide. The article detailed how companies across America were implementing new policies to recognize and honor veterans inspired by what had happened on that American Eagle flight. Marcus read over his grandfather's shoulder. "Looks like you've started a movement, Grandpa." Sullivan shook his head in bemusement. "All because I wanted a comfortable seat for my old back." "No," Marcus corrected. "All because you lived a life of honor that others recognized when they saw it." The Smithsonian meeting the next day was brief but significant. Margaret Chen, an elegant woman in her 40s, explained the museum's vision for the new exhibition on American values. "We don't want to focus solely on combat heroism, Colonel Sullivan. That's been done. We want to explore how the values of military service, honor, sacrifice, commitment, extend into civilian life, and continue to shape our nation." Sullivan listened intrigued despite his initial reluctance. "And you think my recent experience illustrates this?" "Perfectly," Chen confirmed. "A decorated veteran treated disrespectfully, a younger generation of military personnel responding with honor and determination, a corporation learning the true meaning of respect, and then the ripple effect across the nation. It's a powerful narrative about how military values can and should influence civilian life." After careful consideration, Sullivan agreed to loan several items for the exhibition. His Silver Star, the polished bullet casing Martinez Sr., had given him now photographed before being passed to P.F. Miller, the faded photograph of Delta Company 47, and the letter from President Nixon that had accompanied his medal. "These will be displayed prominently in the new exhibition," Chen promised, "along with the story of both your heroism in North Korea and the events of this week." Sullivan had one condition. "The display must include the names of all 7 men I carried out that day. This was never about just me." Chen agreed immediately. "Of course, Colonel. That's precisely the point we're trying to make, that honor is interconnected, passed from one person to another across generations." 6 months later, Sullivan found himself on another American Eagle flight, this time returning to Kansas from a speaking engagement at West Point. The invitation had been one of dozens he'd received since the airplane incident, as he still called it. When he boarded the aircraft, the entire crew stood at attention. The captain personally greeted him. "Colonel Sullivan, it's an honor to have you aboard today." Sullivan was escorted to his first-class seat, a new model specially designed with extra back support, now standard on all American Eagle flights and unofficially known as the Sullivan seat. Once all passengers were boarded, the captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the privilege of flying with Colonel Robert Sullivan, Silver Star, recipient, and the inspiration for the Sullivan-Martinez Veterans Honor Protocol that has transformed how America's businesses interact with our veterans." If you're unfamiliar with this story, I encourage you to visit the new exhibition at the Smithsonian American History Museum. The passengers applauded, many turning to look at the elderly man in 5A with newfound respect. Sullivan nodded politely, still uncomfortable with the attention, but gradually accepting its purpose. The flight attendant serving his section was a young woman with a quiet dignity about her. When she brought Sullivan his coffee, black no sugar, exactly as he preferred, without having to ask, he noticed her name tag, K. Miller. "Any relation to Eleanor Miller?" Sullivan asked. The young woman smiled. "My mother, sir. She sends her regards. My brother Kevin is doing well back on duty with a new appreciation for battlefield medicine." Sullivan nodded pleased. "Tell them both hello from an old soldier." As the plane reached cruising altitude, Sullivan gazed out the window at the American landscape passing below. Cities and towns, farms and factories, all connected by a shared history and common values that sometimes seem forgotten in the rush of modern life. His phone chimed with a text message from Marcus. "Grandpa, great news. Sarah had the baby this morning. 7 bulbs, 8 OZs. We're naming him Robert James Sullivan. The tradition continues." Sullivan read the message twice, emotion welling up unexpectedly. A great-grandson named partly for him and partly for the Martinez family that had become intertwined with his own across 3 generations. When the plane landed in Kansas City, Sullivan was surprised to find another honor guard waiting, this one composed of local veterans from multiple eras. They had come not because of orders or protocol, but because they wanted to honor a man who embodied the values they all shared. The local news captured the moment, ensuring that the story, now known nationwide as simply the Sullivan story, would continue to inspire others. 1 week later, Sullivan sat on the porch of his modest Kansas home watching the sunset over fields that had been cultivated by generations of Americans. His silver star was still at the Smithsonian, but he found he didn't miss it. The medal had served its purpose, not as a personal accolade, but as a symbol of something larger, something that connected one generation to the next. The mail arrived bringing a large envelope from the Smithsonian. Inside was a photograph of the new exhibition. Sullivan saw his silver star in a glass case alongside the faded picture of Delta Company 47, the names of all 7 rescued men prominently displayed. The explanatory text told both stories: the rescue at Khe Sanh and the airplane incident 57 years later. But what caught Sullivan's eye was the exhibition title emblazoned across the entrance in bold letters: "Honor never forgets the continuous chain of American values." Below the photograph was a note from Margaret Chen. "Opening day attendance broke records. Visitors are especially moved by the connection between your actions in North Korea and the response of the younger military generation half a century later. You've given us a powerful reminder that honor once earned is never forgotten." Sullivan carefully refolded the letter and gazed across his front yard to the American flag that had flown there every day since his return from Korea. In the evening breeze, the stars and stripes moved gently, a constant amid a changing world. Inside his home, the telephone rang. Sullivan rose slowly, feeling the familiar twinge in his back, the permanent reminder of promises kept long ago. The pain was an old companion, now almost welcome in its constancy. On the line was General Martinez. "Bob, I'm calling because the president wants to recognize you at next month's Medal of Honor ceremony. Not for Khe Sanh, that opportunity has passed, but for what your story has come to represent to the nation." Sullivan's initial instinct was to decline. He had never sought recognition, had never considered himself extraordinary. But then he thought of young Kevin Miller recovering with the help of medical protocols Sullivan had developed decades ago. He thought of Rebecca Johnson reconnecting with her father's military legacy after years of denial. He thought of David Reynolds honoring his father's memory by ensuring other veterans received the respect they deserved. And he thought of his new great-grandson, Robert James Sullivan, who would grow up in a world that perhaps, just perhaps, remembered a little more clearly what honor truly meant. "I'll be there," Sullivan said simply. As he hung up the phone, Sullivan noticed a school bus stopping at the end of his driveway. A group of children descended, led by their teacher. Sullivan recognized them from the local elementary school where he had spoken last month after returning from Washington. The children approached his porch carefully, each carrying a handmade card. The teacher, a young woman whose own father had served in Desert Storm, smiled apologetically. "I hope we're not intruding, Colonel Sullivan. The children wanted to thank you personally. After your visit, we've had more parents and grandparents volunteer to share their service stories than ever before." Sullivan welcomed them onto his porch, accepting each card with the same dignity and attention he would have shown the president. One by one, the children thanked him not just for his war service, but for reminding America what honor looked like in everyday life. As they departed, Sullivan noticed one child lingering behind, a small boy with solemn eyes and a serious expression. "Sir," the child said hesitantly, "my grandpa was in North Korea too. He doesn't talk about it, ever. But after you came to our school, he showed me his medals for the first time. He cried a little. Was that okay?" Sullivan knelt down to the child's level, ignoring the protest of his aged knees. "That was more than okay, son. That was a gift. A very precious gift." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "That's what Mom said. She said sometimes brave men need permission to remember." "Your mother is very wise," Sullivan replied. After the visitors departed, Sullivan remained on his porch as twilight deepened into dusk. The stars appeared one by one, the same stars that had shone over Khe Sanh over generations of American soldiers serving far from home. He thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A seat reassignment on an airplane, a grandson's phone call, a general keeping a promise made to his father, an airline learning the meaning of respect, a nation remembering, however briefly, that some values transcended profit and convenience. In the quiet Kansas evening, Sullivan found himself at peace with the unexpected attention his story had generated. Not because it brought him personal recognition, but because it had reminded people of something important, something worth preserving and passing on. Honor never forgot. And now perhaps America would remember a little longer too. The Silver Star and the Smithsonian would continue telling its dual story long after Sullivan himself was gone. The story of a young captain who carried 7 men through enemy fire in a distant jungle, and the story of how half a century later, that same commitment to honor had rippled outward, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. In the end, Sullivan reflected that was the true meaning of the medal. Not the moment of courage that earned it, but the lifetime of honor that followed. Not a single act of heroism, but the continuous chain of commitment that connected one generation to the next. Sullivan looked up at the American flag now silvered by moonlight and offered a simple soldier's prayer that the values he had lived by would outlast him, pass from hand to hand like the bullet casing he had given to young Kevin Miller. Because in the passing on, in the remembering, in the honoring of promises made long ago, that was where the true legacy lived. That was how honor found its way home.